Good morning and welcome to yet another session of the NPTEL course Postmodernism in Literature. In continuation with the series of lectures that we have been having, today also we discuss Derrida, Deconstruction and Postmodern texts. So, we have already taken a look at the intellectual tradition which foregrounded the method of deconstruction. We have also seen how it departs from other forms of structuralist inquiries. And we have also taken a look at the various tools through which we can employ deconstruction in different texts and contexts. The objective of today's lecture is to foreground deconstruction as a literary critical method. As much as Derrida had protested against the formulation of deconstruction as a literary theory, as a method of criticism, it is rather interesting to note that in the contemporary, this is one of the most important literary critical methods which are being used across cultures, across literary worlds to engage with different kinds of texts and also different kinds of contexts. And recalling from the previous lectures, it is important to remember that deconstruction is a school of philosophy which originated in France and also attributed to Jacques Derrida. And it also now had an enormous impact on Anglo-American criticism. And when we trace the intellectual tradition, it is also important to realize that deconstruction was influenced by phenomenology, Saussurian and French structuralism, and also Freudian and Lacanian psychoanalysis. But interestingly, though it departed from the various forms of structuralist inquiries, deconstruction eventually emerged as a distinct and a different tool of criticism and also emerged as a school or a movement all by itself. If we look at the diverse kinds of definitions available about deconstruction, we would begin to notice that the literary and critical definitions, the literary and the definitions from within the frameworks of literature, criticism and culture dominate the ideas about deconstruction. If you care to look at Cudden's Dictionary of Literary Terms and Literary Theory, published in 1993, this is how Cudden defines deconstruction. The term denotes a particular kind of practice in reading and thereby a method of criticism and a mode of analytical inquiry. Regardless of how structuralism was originally conceived as a method to protest, to rebel against the various promises made by modernity, the disillusionment with the many scientific rationalist practices, it is now rather a historic accident that deconstruction has been seen primarily as a mode of analytical inquiry and also as a method of criticism. So, he also extensively quotes, Cudden also extensively quotes from Barbara Johnson and goes on to clarify the use of the term deconstruction. Deconstruction is not synonymous with destruction. However, it is in fact much closer to the original meaning of the word analysis itself, which etymologically means to undo, a virtual synonym for to deconstruct. If anything is destroyed in a deconstructive reading, it is not the text, but a claim to unequivocal domination of one mode of signifying over another. A deconstructive reading is a reading which analyzes the specificity of a text's critical difference from itself. We have already noted how deconstruction does not talk about the destruction of meaning, but about the generation of a meaning by focusing on certain aspects of text which are not otherwise readily available or which are not otherwise very visible. Having said this at the theoretical level, it is also important to see how deconstruction works when we apply it to criticism, when we use it as a method of critical practice, when we use it as an analytical tool for inquiry. Keeping in tune with the departures that deconstruction makes as a shift from the linguistic turn towards a deconstructive turn, there is a way in which deconstructive practices could be located at the level of language. But when we begin to use deconstruction as a mode of inquiry, as a method of analytical criticism, we begin to notice that it moves away from the level of language, and language is only a starting point. So, eventually, the way deconstruction works is the ways in which it begins to critically dismantle tradition and traditional modes of thought. So, this is the end result which made Deconstruction perhaps more popular than any other forms of criticism, any other forms of analytical inquiry prevalent in the contemporary. Among the many things that deconstruction proposes to do, it explores the tensions and contradictions between the hierarchical ordering assumed and sometimes implicitly asserted in the text and other aspects of the text's meaning, especially those that are indirect or implicit or that rely on figurative or performative uses of tradition. So, here the play with language, Derrida's use of language, Derrida's deconstruction of language leads us to a method which would eventually allow us to dismantle tradition and traditional modes of thought, and also disturb and disrupt all kinds of hierarchical establishments on which most of the reason based, most of the rationality, most of the thoughts of rationality, particularly those of the Western tradition, have been placed. In that context, the focus is on the opposition of meaning that emerges, as Derrida has extensively pointed out in his analysis of the signifier and the signified, and the difference with an A. And here the opposition works in particular ways in order to show the construction of the text. And here we also begin to realize that the meaning or the opposition is not something which independently exists, but that's also something that emerges from the text. As Derrida and also the other critics have reminded us in multiple ways, deconstruction is not about entirely moving away from the text. Deconstruction is about focusing on the text and foregrounding the things that the text does not apparently make visible rather readily, and also about foregrounding the things which the text perhaps hides through the use of particular kinds of language, figures of speech, or different kinds of performative functions. And when we talk about the ways in which deconstruction has contributed to literary theory, it's important to remember that it has played a major role, as one of the foremost critics would put it, a major role in the animation and transformation of literary studies by literary theory. And it's also because deconstruction is concerned with the questions about language, about the production of meaning, and the relationship between literature and the numerous discourses that structure human experiences and its histories, which are also evident in literary and cultural texts. In that sense, deconstruction also becomes a very comprehensive and all-encompassing kind of literary theory, a critical approach to engage with multiple kinds of texts and contexts in the postmodern scenario. And it would also be not wrong to say that deconstruction helped to bring theory to the foreground in the study of literature in America and later elsewhere. It's also perhaps yet another story that deconstruction is increasingly being commodified for the American market in the simplified, and also it's also been watered down in the form of handbooks, ready-to-use textbooks, so on and so forth. And though, as we have pointed out in the beginning, though Derrida resisted all of these moves, now it is rather inevitable, not just in the Western scenario, but also in the non-Western critical traditions and non-Western writing practices. Now, let's also take a closer look at how this theoretical approach works in different fields. And deconstruction is something that could be used regardless of the disciplinary differences and regardless of the differences in genre or in context or in the cultural settings. So, if we closely examine deconstruction at work in the feminist thinking, we begin to see some of the ways in which they play with the opposition. Particularly the feminist thinkers, the feminist writers and critics, they play with the opposition between the notions about man and woman. They also challenge these traditionally given understanding, the traditionally given meanings which are attributed to the ideas of men and women. They also critiqued the essentialist notions of gender and sexuality, which also forms some of the fundamental aspects of feminist literary criticism and feminist thinking. As Judith Butler's works have been doing, they also challenge the claim that feminist politics requires a distinct identity for women. So, by focusing on this opposition, focusing on the difference within which the meaning-making process had rested so far, the feminist thinkers problematize this difference, problematize these distinct identities which are being formulated, and engage with the politics which is at work, which also produce particular kinds of identities. So, here the feminists used deconstruction to also lead us to be convinced that identity is a product or a result of action rather than the source for it. So, there is no given kind of a meaning, there is only certain performances which would produce particular kinds of meanings. There is no given understanding of a man or a woman. There are only certain performative concepts which are tied with particular kinds of identities. Here we also begin to note the interconnectedness across different schools of thoughts. Here we begin to see how there is an employment of the linguistic turn to begin with, how that influences the modes of departure for deconstruction, and how eventually that also enables the various critical modes within the feminist strands of sorts. And this has also been by extension very influential in queer theory, in gay and lesbian studies as well. And here we begin to notice that deconstruction is not something which could be limited to particular kinds of texts and contexts, but it is something that opens up the fields of study also for the foregrounding of alternative practices. And this has also been heavily used in critical legal studies. Deconstruction has been applied extensively across various forms of legal writing to reveal the conflicts between principles and counter principles in legal theory. And this has also been a rather influential turn from the 1970s onwards. They also explored fundamental oppositions such as public and private, essence and accident, or substance and forms. Again, we see that fundamentally the play is mostly with the idea of opposition and how that generates meaning. And these different forms of disciplines, these different forms of critical practices, they engage with this idea of opposition, the idea of difference, to focus on diverse forms of knowledges which are otherwise unavailable to us. And the field of anthropology, which also maintains close ties with the practice of deconstruction, we notice that deconstruction contributed to an increased awareness of the role that the anthropological workers play, particularly in shaping rather than describing the situations they report on. So here also we find that there is a certain kind of a practical approach that deconstruction finds in these diverse fields of knowledge. In the field of anthropology, in the critical practices employed in the field of anthropology, this deconstructive method has been particularly influential because they also contributed, enhanced the move towards a greater concern about the discipline's historical connections to colonialism. So, in the close reading of the texts and the context and the experiences available, the anthropologists were also able to critically foreground the things which were not apparently visible, the things which were not available as ready-made objects. Rather, they could peel away the multiple layers of meaning which have already been constructed to engage with the other forms of hidden meanings or the other kinds of hidden cultures and hidden articulations, to engage with what has not been readily available. So, here we are also being led to the possibility of identifying many deconstructions. It is not a single kind of deconstruction that is available to us, but there is a possibility of many deconstructions depending on the fields in which deconstruction is employed, depending on the context, depending on the historical possibilities, and depending on the methods required by different fields of study. So, here we also try to list out some of those different kinds of deconstructions available. For example, there is rhetorical deconstruction employed by Paul Deman, who is also an American critic and an active practitioner of Anglo-American literary criticism, and he was also a leading proponent of literary critical theory in the contemporary. And there is a pedagogical deconstruction employed by Gregory Ulmer, who is an American critic who also engaged actively with the novel principles of hypertext and cyber language. And then we have political deconstruction of Michael Ryan, where he uses Marxism as a framework to critique deconstruction. We have obviously the post-colonial deconstruction by Gayatri Spivak, who also initiated a feminist inquiry into subaltern studies and subaltern politics. And there is philosophical deconstruction of Rudolf Gasche, who tried to locate deconstruction within various practices of phenomenology. There is also this feminist deconstruction of Barbara Johnson, who is a critic, a translator and a leading theorist of comparative literature. She is also interestingly associated with the Eyre school of criticism. And there are even subtexts that we could begin to locate from these available classifications. There could be, for example, different kinds of feminisms or different kinds of post-colonialisms available to us, which would lead us to the possibilities of different kinds of deconstructions emerging from within particular fields of knowledge as well. Beneath the apparent diversity and the apparent differences, what is strikingly significant about these many deconstructions are the ways in which they begin to talk about textuality and text. Irrespective of the field of study, texts are available for deconstructive practices. This is also keeping in tune with the dictum that everything is a text. Textuality within the deconstructive framework is the process of reading, and this process of reading is what constitutes the text. The text is not a readily available entity, it is not an object by itself, but it is rather an object which would evolve through the process of reading, which is referred to as textuality. And this also leads us to the possibility of text being undecidable, infinite and open, and this is also something that we started locating in the discussions regarding Barthes and Foucault. We also saw that the text undergoes change depending on the kind of reader, and also that the text needs to be moved away from the authoritative voice of the author. So, when we begin to locate a text, the idea of textuality within the process of reading, what emerges as extremely significant is the point that language does not refer to any external reality. It can, on the contrary, assert several contradictory interpretations of one text. So, these terms which are being foregrounded in this aspect of in these various aspects of deconstruction, such as textuality, the process of reading, the possibility of multiple interpretations, they are all not just limited to the concerns of the book, but rather they have an overarching far-reaching implication, because these interpretations are also based on the political and social implications of language. It is not limited to a connection between the author and the text as it was conventionally thought to be. On the other hand, it is also based on the context which produced particular texts, and more importantly, it is also based on the context from which particular kinds of interpretations and particular kinds of readings are being done. It is also in that sense dependent on where the reader is situated, not just on the basis of where the author is situated. And pushing this a bit more, we also see that it is all the difference, the meaning of the difference or the postponement of meaning is also something which would affect a range of things such as history, politics, economics and even reality itself. This is perhaps the postmodern interest that we have in the idea of deconstruction itself, because it is an all-encompassing framework which would allow us to reinterpret, which would allow us the possibility of multiple interpretations of everything, not just books, not just texts, but also history, politics, economics and even the idea of reality itself. And this difference or the idea of the postponement of meaning is the basis of writing itself, as Derrida would put it. Derrida in fact had extensively worked on the binaries of speech and writing, and also had engaged with the idea of difference, as we have already noted, and all of this, interestingly, they form a basis, they form a framework for understanding not just what we traditionally understand as text, but also across various disciplines which normally would not be seen as subject to any kind of textual reading. This reduction of this reductive understanding of textuality, or rather this extensive understanding of textuality, would enable us to elevate deconstruction to a level that would also enable us to engage with postmodernism through particular frameworks and particular paradigms. Now, going back to the attention that deconstruction as a practice paid to the rhetorical and performative aspects of language, that continues to play a significant role, because it was this particular attention on language and text, on the various aspects of language, the performative and the rhetorical aspects of language, that encourage critics to consider not just what a text says, but also the relationship. Yeah, when we say relationship, it not just always a positive relationship, it could also be a potential conflict inherent in that. So, the relationship or the conflict between what a text says and what it does. So, here, as we have pointed out in one of the earlier sessions, deconstruction is not something that we do to a text, but it is always already inherent within a text. The text has the capability to deconstruct itself. So, there is a possibility of looking at a text and decoding what it says, and also about what it does through the process of language, through the analysis of the performative aspects and the rhetorical aspects of language. And if deconstruction also employs a close reading of text, how would we begin to differentiate the new critics from the deconstructionists? And in the earlier session also we noted how deconstruction has often been seen as another version of new criticism, and we also had indicated that it is not. Because new critics see literature as a freestanding self-contained object, and in the process of new criticism, meaning has to be found in the complex network of relations between its parts, for example, allusions, images, rhythms and sounds. And this process of close reading, this method of close textual analysis is being done to make sense of the ambiguities. And this is what makes new criticism different from deconstruction. So, new criticism, when it was prevalent as a method, particularly in the American academia, it was also adopted in the academic and intellectual circles worldwide because it helped them to make sense of the ambiguities, which also had fit in very well with the aims of syllabi, curricula, the critical practices, so on and so forth. It was rather a neat process of doing a textual analysis in order to make sense of the text. Deconstructionists, on the other hand, they see the works in terms of their undecidability. There is an unfinalizability about meaning, about different attributes of the signifier and the signified right at the outset. They also thus reject the formalist view. New critics are also part of formalism. They reject the formalist view that a work of literature is demonstrably unified from beginning to end, that a work of literature is organized around a single center that ultimately can be identified. While the new critics operate with the belief that there is a unified center, there is a structure which needs to be decoded, the deconstructionists begin with the rejection of this idea of a unified center itself. And if the idea of the center itself is rejected, the possibility of finding a unified meaning also becomes a futile attempt, because there is no way in which one could begin to find a meaning, find an ultimate meaning, find the core of the text which is not there in the first place. So, contrary to the new critics' expectation of making sense of the ambiguities, what the deconstructionists do is to reveal the incompatible possibilities generated by the text, and thus it also becomes impossible for the reader to settle on any permanent meanings. Rather, to look for permanent meanings itself is a futile attempt when we talk about deconstruction. And this also completely rejects any kind of authority which is being invested either to the author or to the critic who wants to foreground a single meaning. Here we again find the privileging of the reader, which we started talking about right through our discussions of Barthes' Death of the Author and Foucault's What is an Author. So, what are the theoretical implications of such a process? Here we also reiterate some of the things that we highlighted during our discussions of Barthes and Foucault. Deconstruction is also about shifting the center of a piece from the author to the reader. This shift is extremely important. We would see in the various readings that we undertake as part of this course, as part of our discussions on postmodernism. And the author isn't it. It's not always about the death of the author. It's not always about the dismissal of the author, but it's primarily about the removal of the author as the authoritative voice. Whether the author is there or not, the authority that he has over a text no longer exists. And this trait could also be seen as something that deconstruction shares with the reader response criticism. In a deconstructive practice, we also analyze what was left out of a text and how that influenced the piece as much as what was actually written into a piece. So, what was actually written is not privileged over what was left out. On the other hand, what was actually written becomes a peel of meaning, a layer of constructed meaning which could be peeled away to reveal what was left out of a text. The meaning making possibility or the impossibility of attributing a single meaning rests on what was left out of a text. And for example, only by analyzing what was left out, maybe we would be able to expose the cultural biases in the text, particularly the ones written from a privileged point of view. And this is also something that we would begin to notice time and again in the feminist readings and also in the post-colonial readings, which are very popular in the postmodern scenario. Let me also share with you an example from Stuart Hall, where he tried to deconstruct the popular. Stuart Hall could be considered as one of the pioneers of the method of cultural studies. While talking about popular in the context of popular culture, Stuart Hall reminds us that popular has an obvious definition, that which sells, and this is based on commercial success, on the generation of revenue. But the question is, how many records exactly do you have to sell to be regarded as popular? Is there any particular definition for that? It varies from context to context. We could think about multiple ways in which we could respond to this question. And there is no one way of talking about commercial success. There is no one way of talking about that which sells. So, it is a contested definition to begin with. And there is also a very different kind of definition which could be attributed to the term popular. If we talk about a popular uprising, if we talk about a popular upheaval, it is also referring to a revolutionary resistance, an opposition, maybe an opposition which is also based on authentic working class experience. But how do we begin to identify the authentic? That is also yet another big question to which there are no single answers. Stuart Hall is not trying to solve the problem of the many definitions which are inherent in the term popular. On the other hand, he is trying to deconstruct the term popular, the meanings which are being attributed to the popular, to arrive at the futility of a descriptive account. And this is what makes deconstruction all the more postmodern, because not only is a process of description a process of lack, there is something lacking in it, but it is also a futile attempt, because there is no single proper definition or a proper description that exists within the language. It is all based on differences, it is all based on performances, as different kinds of theoretical frameworks would tell us. Here are also some useful steps or tips to engage with a particular text through a deconstructive method of criticism. This is not a comprehensive list, this is not a must follow list of steps for doing deconstructive criticism. This is just a random sample of a set of steps, a set of questions which could be asked to different kinds of texts and contexts. First of all, a deconstructive method, a deconstructive critical practice would not be possible without questioning the common sense or the prevailing wisdom, which is also being seen as the truth, which is also a part of the universalizing, essentializing worldview. Because it is very important to unhinge oneself from the traditional interpretations, to be able to engage with the text from a fresh paradigm, to peel away the many constructed meanings and to access the things which are not being readily accessible or available to us. Secondly, since a deconstructive critical practice also has the power to expose cultural biases, we should also be alert to the various forms of biases which are inherent within texts, within particular cultural constructs, and this is perhaps one could even begin to think about the Western or Eurocentric bias which is perhaps present in a particular text, and to see how this bias could be exposed through particular kinds of readings and rereadings. Thirdly is to analyze sentence structure. This could also be seen as a close reading or a close textual analysis. Here is why many also get confused about whether deconstruction is another version of new criticism. And here we particularly pay attention, for example, to the arrangement of the subject and the object, and as the subject being the initiator of the action and the object being the recipient. If I could give a very simple example, a statement: he took her to the store, he bought her earrings, he found some food she would like. Here the subject is he took her to the store, he bought her earrings, he found some food she would like. If we analyze the linguistic parts, if we analyze the different parts of language in this, we also find that the object is took her to the store, bought her earrings and found some food she would like. And here the initiator of action is always the male protagonist. We also find that there is also a denial of agency for the object who is only the recipient of these various actions. So, this could pass off as a simple, harmless, innocent sentence. But when we approach this from a deconstructive angle, when we approach this from a critical practice enabled by deconstruction, we begin to see that there is a way in which language exposes some of the patriarchal biases, some of the denial of agency which is inherent in this text. and this sentence cannot be isolated from the general meaning of the story, because this general meaning of the story or the novel, whatever that this is part of, this on the other hand becomes one of the ways in which one could begin to expose the various biases, to expose the various forms of privileges which are being hidden in the text, which are also being passed off as something very common, which is part of common sense, as part of essential universal truth. So, deconstruction in that sense also ceases to be a mere textual analysis, and it becomes a very political and also a socially concerned kind of critical analysis. And once we begin to open up these words and sentences, an infinite amount of possible interpretations and possible meanings begin to emerge, and the final step is to play with these possible meanings rather than restrict oneself to one particular worldview, because that is what deconstruction is also protesting against. And these multiple readings which are being made available should be the result of the close textual analysis that one is doing. And it is not, again I reiterate, it is not an attempt to make sense of the ambiguities, but it is an attempt to open up the text, open up language to various multiple interpretations which could even be in conflict with one another. A quick comparison between the two texts, Jane Eyre and White Sargasso Sea, would also be useful to understand deconstruction in practice. Jane Eyre, as we know, is a very popular Victorian novel authored by Charlotte Bronte. It was written in 1847, and White Sargasso Sea is a 20th century text authored in 1966. For the uninitiated, Jane Eyre is a novel about the protagonist Jane Eyre herself, and it's in the form of a Bildungsroman. It's about her childhood, about her coming into age as a woman and her relationships, certain complications which are involved in it, and how she is also highlighted as an embodiment of virtue, as a symbol of Victorian womanhood, and how she also finds her place within relationships, within the society and within the structure of family by foregrounding her own character as the angel in the house, vis-a-vis the mad woman in the attic, who is also being present as a counterfoil to Jane Eyre's character. Without going into the details of the story, because time does not permit us to do so, White Sargasso Sea by Jean Rhys is a work which foregrounds the story of this mad woman in the attic, who was close to being villainized in Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. Here we find the 1966 novel deconstructing the 1847 novel to generate a new text. And how is this being made possible? First of all, we can see that there are three different ways in which we can look at the transition, the departure that White Sargasso Sea makes from Jane Eyre. First of all, Sargasso Sea is a feminist critique of Victorian values, which Jane Eyre also embodies. It's a post-colonial criticism of Western colonization, which is in a certain way being celebrated in Jane Eyre's text, and the text and also the many critics of Jane Eyre were also rather oblivious to this inherent celebration of colonization, the colonial practices of the West, which were also evident in the relationship between in the man-woman relationship, which was portrayed in Jane Eyre. And it also postmodern. White Sargasso Sea is postmodern at various levels because it engages with the story from different perspectives. White Sargasso Sea ceases to be the story of Jane Eyre, it ceases to be the story of Bertha Mason, the mad woman in the attic. It becomes an engagement with madness, with marginality, with otherness, with relationships, with marriage, the institution of marriage, with displacement, exile and identity crisis. These are not new elements that Jean Rhys began to invent from Jane Eyre, but rather these were the things which were always already present in the text Jane Eyre. All that Jean Rhys did in White Sargasso Sea was to expose the gaps, was to just peel away the multiple layers of constructed meanings, to expose the biases inherent in it, to expose the various agendas, the various political ideological agendas, the various patriarchal Western Eurocentric biases which were inherent in the text. By allowing a play of all these multiple conflicting elements and identities in the text of White Sargasso Sea, by engaging with feminism and post-colonialism in particular ways, White Sargasso Sea becomes a typical postmodern text itself. In a nutshell, what White Sargasso Sea seeks to do is just not to present itself as a complementary work to Jane Eyre, rather it discovered the gaps and wrote back a feminist and post-colonial text, and postmodern frameworks, I would say, enabled her to do so. The gaps, she also in White Sargasso Sea, we find the foregrounding of the gaps available within the text, and which is this is also being made possible after a deconstruction of Jane Eyre, after having read between the lines of the novel. White Sargasso Sea is a novel which comes into being after having deconstructed Bronte's novel in order to create another novel with a totally different perspective, which is largely non-Western. And here these are the multiple ways in which the novel White Sargasso Sea also becomes postmodern. It engages with plays with postmodern intertextuality, fragmented narrative, multiple narrators, the problematization of Englishness as a national and cultural identity that may or may not be dependent on race. It also exposes the various historical, racial and social hierarchies on which the Western civilization unfortunately rests. So, whether we are talking about Stuart Hall's deconstruction of the popular or the simple subject-object analysis of a simple sentence, or the deconstruction of a particular novel, what is postmodern about deconstruction? So, as we wind up today's lecture, I also leave you with the understanding that deconstruction is also a practice, a critical practice which is inherent to the understanding of postmodernism, and also that it is possible to engage with the many postmodern texts through the interplay of deconstruction. And here what essentially makes deconstruction postmodern is the fact that it joined hands with other strands of post-structural and postmodern thinking, like we just now saw how postmodern could be linked with the post-colonial and the feminist modes of thinking and modes of critiques. Eventually what deconstruction enables us to do, just like postmodernism does, is to inspire a suspicion of established intellectual categories and a skepticism about the possibility of objectivity. This is where deconstruction begins to make sense in the postmodern scenario as one of the most efficient tools, as one of the most efficient analytical critical tools available to approach texts and various contexts. So, as we wind up today's session, I also leave you in anticipation of the discussions on intertextuality that we shall be introducing in the following lecture. That's all we have for today. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to seeing you in the next session.